nicht diese Töne, sondern lasst uns angenehmere anstimmen und Tochter aus Elysium.
Deine Zauber Deine We've got a real treat for everyone here today. We've got a debate that goes right to the heart of what really matters in economics, in political economy, and in money. We've got a debate between Austrian economics versus modern monetary theory. This is a zero hedge debate sponsored by JM Bullion. In the camp of for Austrian economics, we've got Robert Murphy, senior fellow at the Mises Institute and chief economist at Infinio. And in the camp of modern monetary theory, or MMT, we've got Nathan Tankus, research director for the Modern Money Network and publisher of Notes on the Crises. Gentlemen, I am so glad that you are both here. Let's take an opening statement about the question: do deficits matter? Of course, we're talking about fiscal deficits, which is the difference between when the government borrows money to fill the gap between what it spends and what it basically when it spends more than it taxes. Let's start with you, Nathan. Do deficits matter? Please take as much time as you need and define your terms, and then we'll go to Robert.
Sure. Happy to be here. On the whether you've never heard about MMT before or you've heard, much more than you've ever wanted to ever again, except for this debate, of course. The conversation about MMT, or modern monetary theory, which is a school of economic thought and kind of, increasingly broader social science thought, is intimately wrapped up with the question about deficits. Of course, Stephanie Kelton's book is called The Deficit Myth. So naturally, conversations about MMT get reduced down to the deficit, even though MMT has a lot to say on lots of these different topics. Part of this sort of reduction is the idea, well, MMT says deficit doesn't matter, ergo, here's my potted 2-3 points about why deficits do matter, ergo, MMT is wrong and therefore irrelevant. In terms of what MMT scholars themselves say on the question of whether deficits matter, they generally say that they do matter. They just don't matter how in the way that they're conventionally represented. It's not about whether you don't, quote unquote, worry about deficits or you don't assess deficits. It's not that deficits can't ever be too large. It's that it's a different view of when deficits are, quote unquote, too large or when they are too small. And also saying sometimes, or, in a large number of circumstances, they are too small or have been too small. But it's not per se about a sort of level of deficit. It's that the question, especially for a country like the United States, which fits a certain set criteria, doesn't have much foreign denominated debt, meaning debt denominated in a currency besides the currency that the United States issues, which of course is the US dollar, that it has a floating exchange rate, or more precisely, that it's not making an explicit promise to convert its currency into some sort of physical asset or another country's currency. And it's got a certain, set of production structure in which there are domestic resources that can be productively mobilized by money or mobilized by spending. And that's, obviously we can get into a lot more details of all of those points, but that it's not simply that the US is a currency issuer, that a country is a currency issuer, but that they have this broader set of criteria within their economic system, which makes which makes spending using a country's own currency viable. And so then the question comes, obviously, what are the constraints? You can put it in a lot of different ways. The most basic idea of a constraint is a constraint on physical resources that can be mobilized, especially domestic physical resources. And that is the center especially for a country like the United States. And there are other countries that are in other positions that have problems with their production structure, their physical resources, have gone through a series of rolling catastrophes. There are governments for various political, economic, historical reasons why they're in an intense amount of foreign denominated debt and aren't going to be able to get out of it. Maybe they have private sectors that have large amounts of foreign denominated debt that, for various reasons, that government can't maneuver around. But the U.S., as issuing the global currency, not necessarily because it's the reserve currency, i.e., it's a currency that other countries hold, but that it's a currency that other countries owe. That's the driving force. That there are various ways in which other countries are in Hawken dollars, that they, if they want to nationalize their local factory, they've got to cough up dollars because of some set of international treaties. If they violate some U.S. property right, and especially intellectual property right, they've got to cough up some U.S. dollars. And that is, generally, it's these kind of enforced legal obligations that are the driving force of currencies. And the U.S. at the top of that pyramid is in a unique circumstantial position. And so, that's kind of basic thing I'll line out. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, talking about interest rates in the current position, interest rates on government liabilities. But, in terms of the basic perspective, MMT is coming from, that there's a set of criteria that a country has, and that the foundation of the value of that currency is the obligations, is the enforcement of obligations denominated in that currency, rather than kind of other things that you might point to. We can't hear you, Jack.
Thank you, Nathan. Bob, do deficits matter?
Okay, sure. So let me first start out by thanking ZeroHedge for hosting this, and Nathan for your participation. I do think that it's particularly appropriate to be pitting the Austrian school versus the MMT school, because I think the economists in both these traditions care about similar things, making them different from the so-called orthodox mainstream. So, for example, I've said for years, I think many, perhaps most PhD economists, if you said, go up to a blackboard and show me in terms of a balance sheet what it looks like when a commercial bank makes a loan, they really wouldn't be able to do it. And there are many macroeconomists who proudly will say they don't even have banks in their model. They think they can explain the business cycle without even having banks enter the explanation. So say what you will about the Austrians and the MMTers, but we both think that's goofy. So we care about similar things. It's just, as you'll see in the course of this discussion tonight, we come obviously to radically different conclusions about what's the right way to avoid recessions or to minimize their impact. So as far as the issue of, do deficits matter? Does government debt matter? I do agree with the alarmists who, for example, if you look at the latest CBO report in terms of their long-term projections, so they're saying for 2024 fiscal year, outlays are about 23% of GDP, revenues are about 17.5%, so the deficit's about 5.6% of GDP, and the debt held by the public is about 99% of GDP. And then if you look ahead 30 years at the end of their horizon, they've got the deficit rising to 8.5% of GDP and the debt to a staggering 166%, right? So well beyond anything that's happened historically, even after World War II. And the thing that's particularly alarming, I would say, about that is it's not, as in the case of World War II, where there was this one-off emergency, say what you will about the U.S. participation, but given that they went in, it's a huge expenditure. But then once the crisis passed, spending could fall to more normal levels, and then the U.S. kind of grew out. They actually ran surpluses for a bit, and then they just kind of grew out of it. That the economy grew faster than the nominal debt, and that's why the debt to GDP shrank. There's nothing like that right now. This is just all baked into the actuarial realities of the aging of the population, is interest rates, have risen to more normal levels and so on. So, and they're not forecasting any major recession. So I would say these numbers are actually optimistic as far as the CBO projections. So in the terms of, does that matter? I would say yes, but I want to be clear. to me, the primary issue is how much the government spends. That when the government spends, that's diverting resources out of the private sector and into politically motivated channels. And for various reasons, I think that that's not as good a use of those resources. And the financing is, in a sense, a secondary issue. But for example, those numbers I quoted, if somebody said, hey, we can get rid of the deficit by just raising revenues, I wouldn't be in favor of that. I would say, yeah, I don't like the fact that the deficit is this big and it's getting, making the debt grow so much. But to me, the issue is because that's an indicator, a symptom of how much the government's spending. I would want to, quote, solve that problem by cutting government spending, not by raising taxes. So as far as, my concern with the MMT camp and how they communicate to the public, you often, it sounds like they're saying there's this new approach that the orthodox economists, including the Austrians, don't realize that, hey, we can just print money, that there's never going to be an issue of the government being able to pay its bills or finding the money. They can just print it. And so the issue is not, can we afford a Green New Deal or universal health care? It's just a matter of, our priorities and what do we want to shunt resources towards. And I think that that's a straw man, that conventional economic treatises, like, for example, Murray Rothbard's text from the early 1960s, he quite straightforwardly says when the government spends money, there's three ways to finance it. They can do explicit taxation, which is pretty clear how that works. They can borrow, which is just a form of deferred taxation, where we're not going to explicitly tax you today. We're going to borrow the money, but then down the road, as we service the debt or pay off the principal, we're going to tax people down the road. So that's just kind of, deferring it. Or they can print the money, engage in inflation, and he characterized that as hidden taxation, right? So those are just three mechanisms. So they were well aware of the fact that the government can print money to pay its bills, and the way they handle it in their framework was just to say the public is still, in a sense, paying for the government expenditure. It's just now the holders of dollar-denominated assets see, the purchasing power of those assets shrink in real terms because prices go up. So rather than the government taking $1 trillion from you and spending it and prices stay the same, if they just print the $1 trillion and spend it, people don't see their paychecks go down because of taxes, but now their paycheck doesn't buy as much at the store because prices are higher. So it's still, in a sense, the private sector's, quote, paying for the expenditure, even if it's financed through inflation. So I think this isn't some novel mechanism that, the MMTers are bringing to our attention to get through this logjam in the budget debates. I think that's something that economists knew all along. Let me, in the remaining time here in this opening statement, let me just take the time to explain one particular claim that you'll see often in the MMT debates with other economists, or when they're sort of rolling their eyes at the public and, oh, you're worried, these budget hawks, they're thinking that debt held by or issued by the government is analogous to private sector debt, when no, it's qualitatively different. And in fact, and Stephanie Kelton will, has a lot of tweets along these lines, and she does this in her public presentations, she'll try to turn that frown upside down by saying, when you understand the accounting and how these things work, government debt is actually net financial assets to the private sector as a whole. And so the idea there is, if you as a household have a bond issued by a company, that's an asset to the household, but it's a liability to the company. And so if you draw a line around the private sector as a whole, the private sector on net can't have an asset, a financial asset internally. It's just one party within the private sector might owe it to another, and it's a wash. The only way the private sector as a whole, so this line of argument goes, can have a net financial asset is if the government owes it to them. So that's what it is when the public lends money to the government in exchange for new treasury securities. So if the government debt is $34 trillion, yep, Uncle Sam's on the hook for that, but that means the private sector has $34 trillion of a net asset. Okay, so in terms of the accounting, that's fine as far as it goes, but I want to say that's extremely misleading, because people have this idea that, oh yeah, like as a private household, if I have a corporate bond, that's a good thing. That's money coming in to me, down the road, so that's an asset. And so if collectively the private sector is owed $34 trillion by Uncle Sam, that's good for the private sector. But when you push it one step back, say, okay, but how is Uncle Sam going to pay that? It can either tax the public, so that's, you're just taking money at gunpoint and handing it right back to them, say, there you go, we owe it to you. So that's not making the public richer. they can just borrow it. So that's just, kind of rolling down and just transforming who holds the debt security. So that's not a net gain. Or they can print the money. So I agree with the MMT camp. That's true. If the federal government owes $34 trillion to the private sector, they will be able to pay that. They can, if push comes to shove, just print it up. But fundamentally, I want to say, does that really make the private sector richer to print up $34 trillion and hand it over to them? So there you go. We satisfied our obligation. Their wealth has not gone up. And the obvious explanation for that is because there aren't any more factories or farmland or computer programmers or oil reserves, just because the government or the central bank created a bunch of new money and handed it over. And so as simple as that is, I think that is the fundamental flaw with the fancy accounting tautologies that you'll often see from the MMT camp to try to show, instead of viewing the public debt as a burden, if anything, it's an asset to the private sector. And I want to say, once you understand what that means, it should be clear that's not at all analogous to a household having a corporate bond or something where the corporation has to go produce goods and services and earn net income to service that debt. There's nothing socially useful in the way that the government is going to raise the funds with which to service that debt. And so in that respect, I think it's very misleading when the MMT people say to the public, oh, don't worry, the public debt, if anything, is a net asset. So I will wrap it up there, but that's my view as to why government debt is a problem, because you get the goodies up front from the government spending and is deferring the pain. And so, yes, down the road, the government can just print money. That's true, but that doesn't mean it's costless. At that point, it's just the people holding dollar-denominated assets are going to, quote, pay for it. So it's not that you're somehow avoiding the pain, but by spending money now and borrowing, it's deferring it. And I think it's shunting that pain down the road, and it's just going to make it that much more painful. And so that's the sense in which these rising debt projections are a warning. The last point I'll make is, I'm sure many have heard, we're at the point now where interest servicing costs on the debt are higher than what they spend on the military. So when I was younger and budget hawks would worry about these things, that was always some looming threat as, hey, if we don't get our ducks in a row, that's going to happen. Well, those things they were warning about when I was growing up in this literature, they're now coming true. So this is happening in real time, and I think it's important for the public to realize this is serious.
So, Bob, would you count yourself as a deficit hawk?
Yes.
Okay. Nathan, behind you, you have an owl. You are at an MMT school, an owl, not a hawk. Why are the deficit hawks wrong? What do you disagree with the claim that the government debt is out of control and it's spiraling? Why is this not a bad thing? Nathan?
Okay, so I think I'm going to start on the accounting point. I'm kind of very surprised that Bob is taking this tack and emphasizing this point so much in our current conjuncture, because it seems, while this argument kind of had, some degree of purchase in the 2010s, at least among some people, the pandemic itself has been a great illustrator of what Bob is saying, it misses the mark, and why this point about, which I'll restate in a second, about private sector financial positions that MMT makes and so many misunderstand, is so crucial. Namely, one of the big things, whatever you think, you love it or hate it, about the CARES Act and the unemployment insurance payments and the checks and all the rest of the COVID response. The thing that a lot of people had to catch up on was precisely the increase in the financial net worth. And so that's, for clarification, I use the term financial net worth rather than quote unquote net financial assets of the private sector, particularly households in that early period. This is the whole real emergence of the idea of there being this sort of excess savings and all of that is an idea about financial net worth. And yes, a lot of people spent down their financial net worth, but for a lot of others, that boost and increase of financial net worth was something that kind of became more balanced in their household balance sheets simply because their income, yes, their money income grew. But a lot of households, millions and millions and millions of households, experience financial security that they never had before. And even with the cutbacks in these programs and maybe some impacts on their balance sheet, even to this day, with inflation going, CPI going back to 2%, household balance sheets are still in pretty good shape. Obviously, it depends where you are in the economy. But if we look at the household sector as a whole, their balance sheets and their financial positions are in far, far better positions than they were even years and years and years after the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And so I think it's remarkable to kind of say, well, at this point, it doesn't really matter. MMT is misleading, when understanding the analytical point that MMT was making is, critical to really grasping what was going on. I will also say, for all the talk about, these programs being big, and we can debate all sorts of things about them and inflation and so on and so forth, it's important that the vast majority of the increase in, quote unquote, the national debt, in, government liabilities held by the private sector to GDP, or held by everyone else who isn't the federal government to GDP, came not in the gigantic coronavirus program spending era, but came in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And Bob might want to say that big increase was just big deficit spending and big, just, overly generous programs that need to be cut. But from my point of view, and I think it's a point of view shared by many people outside of the MMT world, that big increase came from, the vast majority of it came from not Obama's piddling 2009 stimulus, but came from automatic stabilizers and the radically insufficient response to the great financial crisis. And so it's important to understand that the circumstances that we're in of, say, high government debt to GDP were caused by a lack of forceful response to the great financial crisis rather than otherwise. Which brings us to the question of interest rates, which is, the whole, a lot of what is become increasingly the focus of arguments of, supposedly this is why MMT is all wrong. I will say that, I feel very uniquely positioned to comment on this because I was commenting on it, and in fact working on a report on this issue in the pre-pandemic era, in 2019, in arguments around the Green New Deal. My report, which eventually came out in January 2021, the new monetary policy, was all about foreseeing a question where, as Bob knows, so a lot of traditional Keynesians went, we can do deficit spending because interest rates are so low, that is not MMT's position. And I was foreseeing the period where something would happen, whether it's a big, climate catastrophe or something else, where we were going to be out of the low interest rate period, or outside of the period where the Fed didn't feel like the need to raise interest rates, and this question of using government spending and proposing big programs would be put off off the table because of a fear of higher interest rates, or it's unaffordable because of interest rates are high. And I was proposing various sort of alternative approaches to monetary policy to deal with that question. And, from an MMT point of view, which, dates back many, many years, you can go to writing about this in the 2009, 2010 period, but all throughout since then, the CBO has a fatally flawed modeling process that gets things systematically wrong, not always in one direction, but predominantly in the wrong direction, precisely because macroeconomic reasoning is not part of these models. Especially the long-term projections, that if you cite out to a projection over the 2050s, there's no coherent economic reasoning in them. Because the basic problem here is, interest rates kind of play a Schrodinger's role in these models, where interest rates are so powerful that they're going to cause quadrillion, billion interest payments, interest to 20% to GDP, but those interest rates are going to have no real effect on the economy, as in no one's actually going to spend money, and that spending of the money is going to be other people's income, is going to say, increase demand, maybe say cause inflation, and then the problem is high inflation. So that's the incoherent things in these models is we have, 20% to GDP flows of interest payments of interest to debt, but those interest payments don't go anywhere and don't have any effect. But also they're the problem that are going to cause a fiscal crisis. And that incoherence is something that MMT has been pointing out for a long, long time. And I bring, this can bring him back to the question about debt to GDP is despite we having this great big programs and spending, debt to GDP has risen much less than it did in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Clearly, we're having big flows of interest payments right now. It's, the 2024 fiscal year, the estimate of the deficit GDP is like 6 point something and like 6.4%, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, and a little over half that is interest payments. I don't think that's great, but I also I am not compelled by the CBO's uneconomic projections that this is going to go up and up and up forever. I think we're either going to this is either going to stabilize at, 3.5% of GDP, maybe a little up the more, and that'll be much more income for people who are earning, who are creditors, who are getting interest. And I don't think that's a great way of spending money. And I think there are other monetary policy tools that could replace, that could tighten financial conditions without more interest payments for the private sector. But regardless of how you approach that, I don't think it's going to be some big, gigantic crisis. I think it's going to be, as what Bob sees as misleading, but I think is just straightforwardly the truth. It's going to be more income for a lot of actors. I don't think it'll be egalitarian because the actors are going to be some of the richest institutions in our society. But the main culprit, if you want, is not on the spending side, in at least the non-interest spending side. It's on the choice in interest rates. When you get to debt to GDP ratios this high, or government liability to GDP ratios this high, especially with the Federal Reserve making the totally discretionary choice to pay interest on reserves, especially required reserves, and then a broader concept of required reserves, and then the reserves that are required to be held for all sorts of Basel era liquidity requirement programs. This, I don't think it's a great choice, but it's a discretionary choice. And
Nathan, sorry. I hate cutting people off, but
I've been going out too long. It's fine.
Yeah, but I want to get into the minutia, and I promise our audience we will. This is a totally uncut conversation, but I want to start with the broad ideas. So, Bob, Nathan is saying in 2020, the U.S. government borrowed a lot of money. To my knowledge, when people say, and Nathan will disagree with me, when people say the U.S. printed money, they borrowed money. They issued treasuries that were bought by banks, hedge funds, the Federal Reserve, other countries, the households, bought by everybody, and that is what we mean when we say printing money. I think most of the time, Nathan can disagree later, but the U.S. Treasury just borrowed a ton of money, and everyone wanted to buy it because there was a recession, and a lot of the fiscal programs of the government borrow, some of it went to loans, but a lot of it was sent in direct economic impact payments, and as a result, a lot of people's banks accounts had more money in them, so the wealth increased. And like a thought experiment, if 340 million people in America, if the U.S. government sent people $1,000 per person, so they would borrow $334 billion. Bob, I just want to get your pushback on this. Your claim isn't that the $1,000 wouldn't be in everyone's account, and the private sector has $1,000 more dollars or $334 more dollars. Your point is just that wealth is kind of a alchemical, fictitious wealth because it's real resources are not increasing, right? That's your criticism.
Right, exactly. So yes, if you're an individual and you get $1,000 check from the government and you put it in your checking account, you're $1,000 richer. And since that on the margin is not going to change too much, you feel better off. You don't notice much. But if they gave it to everyone, then it's not quite the same thing, and just exaggerate it. And the point of this, I'm not saying this is what Nathan's position is, but just think through why what I'm about to say wouldn't work, and then you see the principle. And I'm saying it's that, but just not as much. So if if the Fed could, the Treasury could borrow and give everybody and have the Fed monetize it and give everyone $1 billion, every individual in America, and they could all have $1 billion. It would be legal tender, and this is real. This isn't a joke. Everyone's got it. And there'd be a sense in which now everyone's a billionaire. But does that mean all of a sudden everyone would have mansions and yachts and private jets and so on? Of course not, because that wouldn't create more of those physical things next Thursday if they did that. Obviously, what would happen is just prices would go through the roof. And so now having $1 billion to spend wouldn't mean as much because a loaf of bread would cost $300 million, right? So when you understand that's what I'm saying, that the ability of the government to just credit money to people or to say, we owe this to you. So instead of giving actual cash, but to give a treasury security, which is saying an IOU from the government that, hey, that's basically the same thing. And down the road, that's as good as cash. I'm saying that doesn't make the private sector wealthier on net. At best, that just redirects who gets the resources depending on who spends it first and so on. But it doesn't create more aggregate wealth, as opposed to if Martians owed us $1 trillion worth of stuff and they created actual goods and service on Mars and exported it to us because they owed it to us. That would make us genuinely richer. But I'm saying the fact that the U.S. government owes the rest of Americans boatloads of money, that doesn't make Americans richer because they're the ones who have to finance it in real terms. So it's a basic point, but I think it's important to say. And if I could just circle back in terms of the narrative of what happened, going in, when Obama first comes in after the 2008 crisis, and the Romer-Bernstein paper explaining the so-called Obama stimulus package, and they're more, Keynesian, they're not MMTers, but the argument for that, they were saying, hey, right now, if we do nothing, unemployment is going to rise to a certain level. If we pass this so-called Obama stimulus package, we'll limit it to a much lower amount. So that's why we should do it. They went ahead and did the stimulus package, and unemployment went above what they were warning would happen if they did nothing. And then down the road, when the Republicans got their sequester and they had the so-called, budget cliff, and they had all those spending cuts that kicked in, Keynesian forecasters said, oh, this is going to make the economy, if we do this, the economy is going to tank. And it turned out the GDP growth was better with the sequester than what they had forecast as the baseline if they didn't do this horrible thing. So I'm saying with these forecasts, when people, and Nathan kind of alluded to that, oh yeah, they didn't do enough and it's a good thing it's automatic stable. And I'm saying, given how much the debt has mushroomed over the last 15 years, and it's always, oh, they didn't spend enough. Just trust us. If we just spent a little bit more, then it would have worked. And I'm saying, no, they had plenty of government deficit spending, and the Fed certainly did way more than it's ever done in history. And yet the economy was not in great shape as of 2018 even. So that's my view, that it's the government. Or one last point I'll make here. Yes, if the Fed raises interest rates and there's a bunch of outstanding government debt, that will raise the flow of income to the bondholders. But again, where is that coming from? I don't deny that the government, in an accounting sense, can make income flow to somebody, but where the source of that is, it's not that Powell is out there cutting lawns or babysitting and creating goods and services. They're just creating the money. So that's not a net creation of wealth. And so I'm saying this is an illusion to think that the way we're going to grow out of this is just, hey, at least it's income to the interest earners. And I think it's an illusion.
Thank you, Bob. We'll be back shortly before a quick commercial break from the sponsor.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
Nathan, your rebuttal. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So I think the problem with what Bob is saying is, he started out attacking the accounting, attacking, what I call, financial net worth, the idea about government deficits increasing the financial net worth of the private sector. But in his response to my characterization, he's focusing on income. He's focusing on, well, what if everyone gets a certain amount of money, they all immediately spend it, we're already at full employment, so this just creates inflation, there's no quote-unquote real wealth created. The issue with characterizing things this way is we don't live in, say, the 1960s Soviet Union, where money is simply just a little consumer chit that you go wait in line to go get your consumer product. We live in a larger, complex monetary financial system, and people have financial assets not just because of a direct, immediate consumption, but because they have a financial life. They have assets. They have longer-lived assets that they want to acquire. They have long-term trajectory goals in which, in a monetary capitalist economy, these things facilitate. And so their balance sheet positions and their financial net worth matters, and not simply something that is just a direct pass through to immediate consumer goods. And in that context, there are all sorts of circumstances in which increasing the financial net worth of the private sector is not just a direct pass through to some immediate spending. The weakness of their financial net worth of their monetary balance sheet matters. And after 2008, this was very much the case. This was a situation in which a lot of people had very weak balance sheets, and the government stepping in to quickly strengthen those balance sheets would have changed the trajectory of the economy. Bob talks about, Bob, when it gets a result he likes, he says, well, that's the CBO or that's this. When it's a result that he is incredulous to, he says Keynesian forecasters. But it's one and the same thing. Those Obama economists were using the same methodology as the CBO does, and that's a large part where they get these weak and bad results. And yes, they greatly those kind of standard mechanisms greatly underestimated the depth of the balance sheet problem, because they were not, as you said at the beginning, we were not working with models with banks that were truly monetary models of the economy. And yes, and so this is why MMT is also not just for big deficits for the sake of it. MMT is for responding to the problem as it needs to be responded to. In post-2008, we had bad big deficits from not taking bold action, and thus we had these automatic fiscal stabilizers, these automatic programs that paid out, and we had weak tax revenue, and those were overwhelmingly the driver of those quote-unquote big deficits, and that's a bad form of that kind of thing. And yes, having bolder action would have changed those circumstances, but it changes those circumstances precisely by delevering the economy. And we are seeing, there are all sorts of problems with the American economy, but we are seeing that results today in terms of an economy where, because there was big programs, and yes, inflation was an extended issue, which of course we could debate of COVID inflation, but regardless of your position on that, it almost is kind of invariant to that. We are in a very different position in the economy where not all households are poor households, but the household sector as a whole has strong balance sheets. The corporate sector has strong balance sheets. And yes, those were because of big deficits. And thus we don't have the sort of weak, anemic economy that we did in after the great financial crisis. And we're seeing that in terms of, even though the spending programs were much, much larger than the spending programs in during the post-great financial crisis, the increase in the ratios is much, much less. We do have, so it's that big hangover that leads to the situation where if you raise interest rates to 5-6%, you're getting a 3% interest payments to GDP.
Bob,
so can I respond to that?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as the, accusing me of trying to have it one way or the other, I think just in your answer that you reiterated that it sounded like you were saying that in the wake of the financial crisis, look at how the government action, in conjunction with the central bank, bolstered balance sheets. And that's something that, Murphy's missing. But then you go on to say, and because they were so timid, that's why it didn't work as well. And so I'm saying, what is it supposed to be a good economy or a bad economy? I think you're saying it's a success story. The reason, yeah.
Timid was 2000, post 2008. Bold was 2020.
So when you were saying, look at all the action, how it bolstered their balance sheets, that wasn't in post 2008. You're talking about post COVID.
It wasn't 2008 because and this is what's crucial to understand about MMT, and this is what MMT was saying at the time. QE is not bolstering private sector balance sheets. It's just a swap of one government security or government guaranteed security for another. Does not increase the financial net worth of the private sector, and thus is not strengthening those balance sheets and getting the economy out of the weak anemic position. MMT is not, was not gung-ho with QE as stimulating the economy.
Okay, so is the reason we had a lackluster response during the Obama years because they didn't deficit spend enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I thought you said, the reason the deficits rose so much is because they didn't take bold action. So that's what I'm saying. It seems
I
like
think
on
I
the one
can
hand,
explain. Okay,
yeah.
I think Nathan is saying that the government didn't do enough deficit spending in 2008, 2009, 2010, and as a result, as a result, GDP was weak and inflation was weak, and therefore the debt to GDP actually went up a lot more. Whereas this time in 2020, the U.S. did bold action, and even though the U.S. spent and borrowed a ton of money, nominal GDP was really high, some of which is a good thing, real GDP, some of which inflation is a bad thing. But because nominal GDP has been so high, debt to GDP has actually stayed flat. Is that your point, Nathan?
So the point, bold action is making a discretionary fiscal program to change the economy, to strengthen balance sheets through deficit spending. What happened in 2008, yes, there was the Obama stimulus, but the vast majority of the increase in deficit is increase of deficit to GDP is first negative GDP and then weak GDP, negative negative money GDP and then weak money GDP, and then second, the automatic fiscal stabilizers. Because the economy is weak, there are certain automatic fiscal programs are triggered, which of course is better than nothing. It's better than if we didn't have automatic fiscal stabilizers, but it's better to preemptively strengthen balance sheets in the private sector than wait for the economy to crash and then have deficit spending leak out through these type of automatic fiscal stabilizers.
Okay, so I guess quick response to that is during the Obama years, I believe there were 4 years in a row where they had deficits higher than $1 trillion, which was just unheard of at that time. And so, yeah, again, this is kind of what I'm saying, that the response is always, oh, we just didn't do enough. And the reason the deficit got so big is because we weren't willing to deficit spend enough early on. And okay, and then now the alleged success story of what they did post-COVID, we had the worst consumer price inflation in 40 years. But again, that's not the fault of what we did. That's something else. So I'm just saying it's always something else that's why it doesn't actually work. Like nobody liked the economy in 2012 through 2015. Nobody thought that was a good economy. Nobody thought we had a good economy from 2021 through 2023. And it's always, we're doing it just, if we just had more money printing or more injections of central bank money, they would have done it right. And I'm just saying, I think the simpler explanation is no, leave it to the private sector. More government intervention is what's causing these problems.
The problem with that is you're mixing up a lot of different problems. People are not complaining about, the corporate sector is not complaining about having much stronger balance sheets. Households, they didn't, and of course I've written about this, the post-election about this, there's various things that they did not like. The thing that households didn't like, especially, the households that are the vast majority of consumer spending, upper income, wealthy households, is not middle income households, is not the strengthening of balance sheets that came from those programs. And like it or not like it, the strength of households of the consumer economy as a whole, again, that isn't saying about questions about inequality, but of the economy as a whole is not the thing that they disliked. And yes, you can, if you talk about it in an abstract enough level and not talk about COVID and not talk about the supply chain issues that were coming out of COVID and all sorts of things that are coming out of COVID, then you can say, well, that shows that that none of this can possibly work, and you just got to leave things alone. But we can look and see how weak private sector balance sheets were. I mean, this is kind of the strength of kind of what MMT is trying to get people to focus on, is you can, say, they were doing so much in the 2000s, in post 2008, but a lot of that, from your point of view, is about central bank action, which is, MMT was very critical of and was focusing on the wrong thing, because monetary policy, even in the best of times, can't increase financial net worth, especially can't widely distributively increase financial net worth of the whole private sector, and especially the household sector. And when you look at those balance sheets, they were very weak. People were underwater on their homes. It is not like it is not an unknowable thing that the private sector was up to its eyeballs in debt, and we have all sorts of problems in our society now, but private sector private debt to GDP, household debt to GDP is far, far, far lower than it was in the 2010s. The private debt to GDP was the central problem of the 2010s, and we are in a totally different world in terms of private debt to GDP. And yes, the deficit spending was able to do that. Now, our problem, our central problem in 2020, 2021 was not private sector debt. It was other issues. So the fact that deficit spending did an enormous amount for helping deal with private debt and people are unhappy is not surprising, because that wasn't their top priority problems coming out of COVID. That was their top priority problems coming out of 2009 to 2010. So the point isn't that deficit spending can solve any possible problem that you need. The point is, in 2009, 2010, there were very, very weak private sector balance sheets, especially household balance sheets, and we have seen exactly that deficit spending can indeed improve private sector balance sheets tremendously, can deleverage the private sector of private debt, and increase its financial net worth. The final thing I'll say, yeah, you can go for it.
Okay, so Jack, I know you probably want to move it. Let me just really quickly here. Again, go back to my simple thought experiment. If the government just creates $1 billion and gives to each household, that would be great for each household's balance sheet. They could pay off their mortgage, pay off their credit cards, everything. Their balance sheet would be great. It's just, price inflation would go up. And then Nathan was, well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't these are different problems. You're mixing two things, Bob. That's not a balance sheet problem. It's an inflation problem. Maybe there's supply chain. And I'm saying what Nathan is saying is exactly what my worldview would predict to happen, that if the way you, quote, solve the balance sheet problem is by creating a bunch of money and funneling it to people so that it's their asset in the private sector, that can solve that problem. But now the rabbit pokes its head up elsewhere in terms of prices are rising. So again, the government, if it just pays off everyone's debts, that would solve their balance sheet problem. But it's not because the government had all this wealth. It's just creating money, and that doesn't make the economy, society as a whole, richer because the government created more U.S. dollars.
Bob, I want to now ask a question.
And this is why it's important. Well,
go ahead, Nathan.
Just let me give one little response. This is why it's important to understand the accounting. Because if what they're doing with those dollars is paying off their private debts, paying off debt is a form of saving. And if what it is going is just one way out the other, paying off their private debts, then it is not becoming spending. I totally agree with you. If you give people a whole bunch of money and they pay down their private debts and they still have a whole bunch of more money and then they spend, and we've already an economy that is close to capacity, then you can start go up against capacity constraints, cause all sorts of issues, maybe get price increases. But when you're in the hole big enough and the problem is deleveraging, they mainly pay off debts. And then on top of that, we're not anywhere near capacity constraints, then it does something, and it is unique. It is a unique, novel point that is true in terms of paying off debt, and that if you focus on the constraint being inflation, then that means there's a margin, there's a portion where you can strengthen household balance sheets without having much impact of spending. And it's really the opposite a lot of ways of, Keynesian, traditional Keynesian ideas, because MMT, in a certain sense, MMT is saying the multiplier is so low, and that's great because you can strengthen a lot of balance sheets before you hit the point in which you have to worry about pay-fors, whether, and we'll get to this later, if they're fiscal pay-fors or non-fiscal pay-fors, whether you need a demand offset to not have overstimulate the economy.
All right, we will move on, and Bob, I think it's my perception a key claim of MMT. Nathan can add details later. Is that deficits by themselves are not a problem. What is a problem is that deficits can cause inflation. through your work, you've got a piece that was an original review of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. That's a great piece, and we'll link to it. I recommend people check it out. I think that you actually somewhat agree with this claim, right? Because Venezuela, Zimbabwe, the problem of governments borrowing too much money, it is always inflation, right? It's not like once debt to GDP hits 500%, the sun's not going to rise. It is always inflation. Do you, at least in some way, agree with the core claim of MMT, a core claim of MMT, that deficits are a problem because they cause inflation? And maybe in your piece, one of your points was that it's actually not a radical claim.
So I'll say this, that I do agree with, Kelton, and I'm sure Nathan as well, that ultimately, if the government wants to produce a bunch of tanks, or if they want to provide universal health care, or if they want to, revamp the electricity sector to be zero emission, that ultimately the constraint on that is real resources. That if, some poor economy somewhere where they don't have a lot of capital goods, they can't do as much there just because they don't have the tools to work with. It's not that if they just printed enough money, they could magically do things. So I think, Kelton and so forth, they emphasize that. But where I disagree is it seems like they think there's all this spare capacity and all we have to do is print money in the right circumstances and mobilize all of this idle capacity, and that you can do that and you can get all this extra wealth generation. And from the Austrian perspective, we're saying, no, what happens periodically, the reason there is high unemployment, for example, is because of a previous bout of government intervention into the banking system, creating artificially cheap credit, which causes an unsustainable boom. And then workers, they're in the wrong lines and they have to get reallocated. That's what the business cycle is in the Austrian framework. And so, if you understand why outright central planning doesn't work, we need market prices. A group of experts in Washington can't just plan where all the real resources need to go for the economy. If you understand that doesn't work in terms of outright central planning socialism, then to say, oh, but we can have a bunch of MMTers get together and decide where all this spare capacity needs to be deployed, because really it's just the real resources that are the constraint. And I'm saying that's utter hubris. And in practice, no, they're not going to be able to do that. So yes, there is a sense in which it's ultimately real resources. But again, any government spending redirects real resources from where they otherwise would have been. And in the Austrian view, the reason you do have temporary periods of high unemployment or idle factories or wherever, it's not because the free market doesn't work. It's because there have been these previous bouts of massive government intervention that screws up price signals.
Nathan?
Yeah, so I think on some basic level, this idea of misallocation of resources, or, misallocation of labor, or labor needs to be reallocated from some activities to another, and thus that's why high unemployment is happening. For that concept to work, you have to have a number of sectors where there's these extreme shortages, and these other sectors where there are these, extreme surplus of laborers. The proverbial, we've got way too many construction workers and we have way too little of X. Clearly, systematically, I think the evidence bears this out, that there are plenty of time periods in which that is not the case, that there is way too many construction workers and there isn't any other sector that would magically absorb them if only these people get retrained. So I don't think that in the terms of not Keynesianism, but Keynes in his original book, this is essentially an argument that there's no such thing as involuntary unemployment, i.e. unemployment connected to deficiencies of demand, that it's all just frictional unemployment. It's all these just sort of frictions, allocating people from one thing to another, and maybe the fluctuation in the frictional issues goes up and down, and that's why unemployment happens. But it's essentially all sort of on like some sort of supply side coordination thing, and I just do not think that's true. Now the question of either beyond the question of having deep recessions, This is what my monetary policy report from January 2021 was all about, was thinking precisely this question of what do you do when you have does MMT have anything to contribute when you have an economy roughly like the economy that you had in 2019? And I do think MMT leads to a very different perspective, because if the issue is revenue, if the issue is, getting the money from somewhere, then it tells you that you're inherently constrained in certain ways, but not others. Whereas if the constraint is physical resources, then you have different programs. Taxing the rich might not, disemploy a certain amount of resources that you need to disemploy to reallocate resources to other sort of programs, but nevertheless, it'll collect a lot of revenue. And so it's these kinds of contradictions that, like, MMT brings out a very different perspective. That report is holding on to one example of non-fiscal pay-fors, of things that can reduce demand without collecting a dime of revenue. That example in that is financial regulation. It can be other things, but though that can do a lot. Now, this, of course, brings up that specter of central planning. Think about the term central planning is, if you construe it narrowly, then we're not talking about central planning. We're not talking about the Soviet Union, one set of people in 6-7 people in a room who are deciding everything. But all systems are designed. Our economic system is designed, and design. Unless you're going for ideas of, say, abolish the legal system and let's just let things rock, all sorts of choices are happening in how we are designing our economic system, and there's all sorts of designs that you can do, that some that will get better outcomes and some that will get worse. And I don't think, and there are all sorts of collective problems that we do need to kind of answer with, yes, policy design questions. Things like climate change involves massive mobilization of resources. And I don't think that there is, we just got to slap a price on carbon and then the private sector will magically fix it. The private sector is not going, the private sector in some, fancy price game is not going to be the thing that makes decisions about how our, electricity grid works. We kind of have to make choices on how our electricity grid works. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be some government commissioner going, well, we need to hit 30% of this and we're going to, just direct it bottom high. But you do need to design the system and design policy to incentivize certain outcomes over others. And there's no kind of alternative. Policy will always be incentivizing certain outcomes over others, and you need to make design choices to incentivize certain outcomes. And yeah, I do think that we need public money to incentivize people to make choices. You can say, for example, anyone who can produce a certain car or a certain train that will only use this amount of carbon emissions, or can be produced only causing this X amount of carbon emissions, and you can let other people, entrepreneurs, respond to that incentive, but you still need some public money, some incentive, and I think public money is a good way of doing that kind of incentivizing, and that we do have all sorts of public projects that we need to do to respond to our problems. And I'm not a big fan of government officials. You can kind of, if you want to look at my Twitter account and see my opinion on current events, that you can. I do think it requires a lot of sort of participatory, organized individuals organizing politically in their own lives to get the kind of public programs that we need. But to me, saying, oh, we just need to withdraw from any of this stuff going on and then the private sector will figure it out is just an abdication of leadership, of responsibility, of any of the things that we need to do. And
let me just to show that I'm not erecting a straw man here, because Jack had asked, is it really is it so much the deficits, or is it really that's going to lead to price inflation? And so then I was tying it to, so for example, in the Finding the Money documentary, they featured Stephanie Kelton. That's the one for folks at home. If you saw the viral clip of Jared Bernstein, they borrow money. Well, okay. And he's like trying to walk through the mechanics of it. And he gets all tied up in knots. It's hilarious. So that documentary, when they are talking about, hey, we're not saying printing money is a panacea. We understand ultimately the constraints are real resources. So if we want to do a Green New Deal, we got to get down and think about what's the real reason. And I'm saying, I'm not putting words in their mouth. They're talking about, we got to see, do we have enough real resources to be able to fund these things? So that's what I mean. So yeah, they're not talking about monopolizing the entire economy, but they are talking about, if we want to do some big grandiose project, we have to look and see, do we have enough real resources to do that? And I'm saying in practice, no, the way the economy solves that is firms have balance sheets and accountants who do profit and loss calculations. And that's the way in a voluntary economy, a system, you make sure that one enterprise is not using more resources than it's actually delivering in value to the public. And you can short circuit that by having an entity that can just print money, but that doesn't all of a sudden make its operations efficient. That just means they can come in and sort of, direct resources to them because they can create money. And so again, if you understand why central planning doesn't work, I'm saying this is that, a percentage of that. So it's not going to be as bad, but it's still not going to work for the same reason.
Thank you, Bob. We will be back with this debate. Sorry, Nathan. We will be back shortly after a quick message from this debate's sponsor.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals. They're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion.
We are back with our debate about modern monetary theory versus Austrian economics. So far, we've talked a lot about modern monetary theory. I want to have a little bit of a question on Austrian economics, Bob, and this is kind of a hardball. How do you apply Austrian school of economics, the Austrian business cycle, to the Great Depression? In my mind, I think in the mind of a lot of orthodox economists or Keynesians, the Great Depression was a private sector failure. There was no borrower. There was no government. Someone needed to spend money, and you had a deflationary cycle. And how does the say 1929 to 1937? How do those 8 years validate, in your view, the Austrian theory of the business cycle and Austrian economics?
Well, sure. As a good capitalist, let me shamelessly plug, I have a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal, which goes through all this. But yeah, I actually think it's a great illustration once people know the actual facts. So contrary to what people may have heard, Herbert Hoover had the largest peacetime deficits in U.S. history up to that point. And then FDR came, and his New Deal really just expanded upon what Hoover did. And in fact, one of FDR's chief lieutenants at the end of the 1930s admitted that, yeah, Hoover, we didn't say it during the 32 campaign, but all we did was just kind of expand what Herbert Hoover had done on his watch. All right, so there's that element. So it's far from Herbert Hoover being tight-fisted. The question is, even if Herbert Hoover, quote, did nothing like the history textbook tell us, his predecessors also didn't do anything either. There wasn't the SEC, there wasn't FDIC and so forth beforehand. So why did we get this Great Depression? I'm saying the thing that changed, among other things, is Hoover. When the stock market crashes in 29, there's a panic. People are withdrawing their money from the banks, and so the money supply in terms of like M1 or M2 was shrinking. And so normally what would happen is prices would fall and wages. And Hoover went to the labor unions and big business and said, don't cut wage rates, because he was operating under this theory that, in a recession, what happens is as prices fall, then, people don't spend as much, and then it's just a downward spiral. So he thought we can nip that in the bud. As long as the workers keep getting paid the same, they'll go out and keep spending up. And so, but what happened in practice is as prices fell and wage rates were rigid, that just meant the real price of labor went way up right when the economy was falling off a cliff. And so that's why unemployment went up to 25%. I would also say, too, in terms of looking at the FDR administration, that they were doing all of the alleged things that were good. And always, again, the story is always just, it was too little too late. That they ran unprecedented peacetime budget deficits, and yet the economy was just in this depression for years. You can compare the U.S. to Canada, and Canada did much better, right? And so it's, no matter what kind of excuse you come up with as to why was this so bad, the answer cannot be because they didn't inflate enough or they didn't deficit spend enough, because they did more of both than had been happened in U.S. history up to that point. So, that would be my response. Last thing I'll say is mainstream economy, like Irving Fisher, thought the Fed was doing a great job in the 1920s because consumer prices were relatively flat. So in his idea, that's not, whereas the Austrians were warning, no, the interest rates are still artificially low. So there were productivity improvements. So prices should have been gently falling because the Fed was pumping in money from 25 onward. That's why CPI was relatively flat. And so the Austrians knew there was a crisis brewing.
Is my understanding there was kind of a sovereign debt bubble in European debt in the 1920s, and I hope even Nathan would agree with me that actually was a problem because it was denominated in gold, so you can't print that. So they were not a monetary sovereign. But Bob, just and tell me where you think I get this wrong. But it's and I've read far fewer books about the Great Depression than both of you gentlemen, and Bob, you've even written a book about it. But it's my understanding that let's say Britain, there's deflation. Gold is coming out of the country, so the economy goes down, so tax receipts go down, and therefore the UK is suddenly running a 1%, 2% budget deficit. What do they do to? Yes, Nathan, we'll get to you in a second. What does the government do? They cut, because they're 1% budget deficit. That's a problem. 2% budget deficit. They cut into a recession, and that makes it worse. What about that is wrong? And sorry, my point, Bob, is that. Is my understanding that a lot of the orthodoxy of, let's say, in 1928 and 1929 is somewhat aligned with what you're saying, where if we have a 2% budget deficit, we have to cut.
Are you saying cut government spending? Is that
Yes.
what you mean? Okay, so a lot of the Austrians at the time, I'm just going to report what they were saying. Like Mises wrote about this, and I think Hayek as well. So during World War I, all the major belligerents went off the gold standard. The U.S. not as much. They banned the export of gold or something. But the U.S. was relatively good, but all the other belligerents clearly severed their link. And so Great Britain in particular, they printed up a bunch of British pounds, but then they wanted to go back to pre-war parity. So that was the problem that Great Britain faced, is they needed massive deflation to get the pound gold ratio back to the pre-war parity. And so Mises wrote saying he thought that was a bad idea. He was saying that's like, if you run over someone going forward and then put the car in reverse and back up thinking you're going to undo the day. Say, no, given that the inflation happened, just revalue the pound at the new rate. Don't try to do the deflation. That's just going to cause another set of problems, that are going to hit different people. So that was, one blunder as far as Mises was concerned about what they were doing. But beyond that, again, it's if you look at like central bank policies, what they were doing in the early 30s was the exact opposite of Walter Badge's rule about lend freely but at a high rate of discount. That was kind of like the orthodox view among central bankers before the Great Depression. Was if there's an entity that's illiquid but solvent, let them stay afloat but charge a high rate of interest. Whereas what the central banks across the globe cut rates in the early 30s thinking they were helping, and all that was doing was allowing institutions to limp along. So cutting government spending, I actually think that would be fine. What really is a bad idea, because deficits were high, the Hoover administration jacked up tax rates. So that's clearly a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. Nathan.
Yeah, I just want a quick comment. I'm a little surprised to hear Bob's comments. I guess, there's probably, not everyone is alike, but, George Selgin's writing a lot recently, his point also kind of from, I would say broadly Austrian perspective, although I guess Bob might disagree about Selzin's bona fides.
Selzin doesn't call himself an Austrian, just so you know.
He doesn't call him an Austrian himself anymore? Not anymore?
No, he's above labor.
All right, fair enough. But a lot of his stuff recently, maybe I'd be fascinated for you to get into it with him, has been all about the New Deal not being Keynesian, the spending programs being tiny. He goes so far as to, say that FDR was a budget balancer, which I don't think is quite right. I think, they were happy to, they deficit spent on relief and talked about we're going to balance the non-relief budget. And so that's why they got, there were even spending cuts in 33, even as they were launching relief programs, was they wanted to balance the not relief budget and sort of use quote unquote relief as what I would call like a proto-automatic fiscal stabilizer. But Selzin's, argument, which I think lines up pretty strongly, is that those spending programs were pretty tiny, especially pretty tiny as a percentage of GDP. They may have accomplished a lot. They may have built a lot of hospitals. And, of course, I think the direct job creation programs at that time are great and, inspires a lot of what, I'm interested in or what MMT is interested in. But it's not because they were big deficit spending programs. That doesn't, to even being sort of even in principle convinced of some of these different ideas about spending comes about in 38, with people like Beardsley Rummel. So to me, this is just, this is the kind of argument, if you kind of deny this whole point about automatic fiscal stabilizers and the collapse of national income, making deficits without any sort of discretionary choice on the government's part, if you just make that, it's big deficit spending, then it's easy to tell this story without the this point about stabilizing national income and the programs to do it seeming like they don't matter or to be counterproductive. But yeah, it's just a basic question of causality. Is it one or is it the other? And I think there's good reason to think, the Great Depression happened and that's what collapsed those tax revenues and got certain sort of automatic programs spending more. And of course, we have a lot more automatic programs now.
So just real quickly on that. So, I haven't read the particular thing of Sudger's. So if the claim is by modern standards, the debt to GDP or, the deficit as a share of GDP under Hoover and then FDR was not particularly outrageous, I'm okay with that. But I'm saying it was bigger than it had been prior. And so if the question is, why was the 1930s depression so long, whereas earlier depressions with a small d, or they might have called them panics, were sharp but short-lived, and then the economy bounced back, 18, 24 months later? Clearly the answer is not because, in earlier ones, we had all these automatic stabilizers, and then Calvin Coolidge came along and dismantled all that. That never was there. Hoover did the most to date. So the explanation's not they didn't spend enough because their predecessors hadn't also. So I can agree if, like, what Selgin wants to argue is the National Labor Relations Board and all those other New Deal interventions did a lot more than just mere deficits. Fine. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff FDR did that I think was bad and hobbled the economy. But my point is clearly the conventional fifth grade explanation of Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing guy who felt his hands were tied and it wasn't the proper role of Washington to help unemployed people. That can't be the whole explanation because that was true of all his predecessors.
Yeah. So put aside the fifth grade child's explanation, which underplays how much of Hoover was a precedent for the New Deal, and, especially the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is why we got to move on beyond the fifth grade, kind of elementary school explanation. And the missing factor in your whole narrative here is private debt. World War I, again, a program of time and looking at financial net worth. World War I is a period where, of course, you have big deficit spending because it's a war, and there's a full total mobilization of resources in the society. Coming out of that, private debt is very low. Over the 1920s, you have a great growth in private debt, incredible growth in private debt, especially as it gets to that that latter mania period, and the Great Depression, and especially by the point you hit the stock market crash of 1929, you have a tremendous amount of private sector debt relative to what we now call GDP, and that was a deeply indebted economy that needed to get out of that debt one way or another. You can do it the painful way, which is limp along for a decade, 20 years more, whatever it is, and default your way out of that debt. Or you can do it in a less painful way, which is just directly strengthening balance sheets using the government and using active fiscal programs. And that isn't real. And yes, we should talk about it in terms of our modern understanding, since the economic variable we think that matters is income, is national income, and is in balance sheets relationships to income. Then yeah, we should think in terms of whether these programs are a drop in the bucket relative to income, or whether they're large relative to income. And the 1930s, directed job creation, were able to alleviate the worst aspects of the Great Depression, not quite have full employment, but move out of disaster levels of unemployment. But private sector balance sheets were still quite weak, at least until you get to really the last stages of it. And thus you never had the sort of vibrant economy you do coming out of a war. And why is it coming out of a war you have those vibrant balance sheets? It's because, which isn't saying everything about the economy is great, but if we're talking financially, it's that private debt is low and the financial net worth is quite high. And then, of course, post-war, there's a stabilization process, a regularization process, as people can buy things that they weren't able to buy during full mobilization wartime.
Yeah, and all that debt is denominated in gold, which you can't get out of that. You got to pay it, and unless there's a new discovery of a mine in South Africa.
That's why
FDR did in 33.
Well, he didn't just do that. He abrogated the gold clauses. He forcibly redenominated not just public sector debt but private sector debt into dollars, and prepared his speech that he was going to ignore the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court knocked it down, and then they didn't, so he didn't have to give the speech.
Interesting talk. Let's now move to the present. Bob, in your piece, your review of Stephanie Kelton's book, you talk about the myths of modern monetary theory, and you get into the plumbing. And I would be really interested, Bob, after you elucidate your criticisms, to see Nathan's response to this. Let's start with just the simple fact of who does the Treasury borrow money from the private sector, and can the Treasury run a negative balance with the Federal Reserve? Bob, share your criticism.
Okay, sure. So, and I have read some of Nathan's material, so I know he's going to disagree with this. But yeah, my perspective is what you will like in Stephanie Kelton's book. She says matter-of-factly that when the government, I might not be getting the exact numbers right here, but this is definitely the spirit of it, that if the government wants to spend $30 billion buying fighter jets, they just direct the Fed to mark up the accounts of the defense contractors, and that's what they do, and that's how it works. And that isn't how it works, right? Right now, the Treasury is not allowed to spend more than it has in its checking account. All right, they have to raise money in terms of the logistics, the same way that a corporation or a household does. The Treasury has to first, if they're going to spend more than they already have in terms of receipts coming in from taxes, they have to float new bonds. The Fed is not allowed to directly monetize that. It has, it's kind of a shell game, but strictly speaking, the Treasury needs to, quote, raise the money first before it can spend it. And so that's, I'm saying in terms of the plumbing, and that's literally, in the rules, right? It's like in the early 1980s, I believe. In my piece, I give the exact timeline of when this happened, but it's literally, in there that the Treasury is not allowed to overdraft its account. So in that respect, that's what I'm saying, that it's both the spirit and the letter of these breezy MMT discussions with the public that I just object to. I think it's very misleading that on the one hand, as if to say they're getting those fighter jets almost magically for free. It's not costing anything because they can just create the money. That's obviously misleading, but also in practice, it's not true the way the rules work right now that the Treasury can just go spend that money. No, they do need to either tax it or borrow it. And yes, the Fed behind the scenes is monetizing stuff, but I'm saying strictly speaking in terms of the mechanics and how it's described, that's actually not how it happens.
Yeah, and so Nathan, so Stephanie Kelton, like you, Nathan, and like Bob, is a student of the monetary system and the monetary mechanics, and her book, The Deficit Myth, was written for a general audience. So she, of course, made simplifications in the same way, Bob. You and your you have academic work, and then your book about the Great Depression, politically incorrect version. You probably made a few simplifications for a general audience. But when it comes to the brass tacks, Nathan, isn't it true that when Congress signs a bill, they're going to buy a jet from Boeing? The Treasury is going to use money to buy that from Boeing. That money is either going to come from the bank account with the Federal Reserve, and if there's no money, they have to borrow by issuing bonds that then the private sector buys, right? And I'll add a nuance that before there's the Treasury has two accounts, one with the Federal Reserve, one with basically private sector banks. Before 2008, roughly, most of the balances were with the private sector. Now, almost exclusively, all the balances are with the Federal Reserve. So, and it's only a nominal, small, $2-5 billion with the private banks. But basically, Nathan, is Bob wrong?
Yeah, so I think both the question and Bob's answer is just a basic misunderstanding of what MMT is saying. MMT is saying not the Treasury doesn't issue Treasury securities, which is kind of the implication of the way a lot of this stuff gets talked about. It's saying that the government as a whole, as my piece from 2020 says this as a sort of restatement trying to really clarify this, money finances its spending. And the basic point that MMT is making is just a different analytical point, which is how do things look when you consolidate the entire federal government, and making the argument, which essentially comes down to a legal argument of consolidating the Federal Reserve System as a system that is made up of a government administrative agency and then these government corporations, as other government corporations traditionally get consolidated with the rest of the federal government, that is how the accounting works when you do that consolidation. A lot of people see this as so horribly misleading. Interestingly, it's only kind of really controversial when MMT says it. When Federal Reserve economists or economists at other parts of the government do this sort of consolidation, or mainstream economists do this kind of consolidation to do their own monetary analysis, it's treated as not so controversial. But when MMT does it, it's treated as this super controversial idea. Everyone is consolidating various government entities all the time when they're talking about the budget. Trump has this new proposal of the External Revenue Service, and let's say that really gets created. Well, when you talk about the budget, you're going to be consolidating the internal and the External Revenue Service. And that's misleading because they're technically distinct entities. Well, for the analytical point you're making, it doesn't matter, and you consolidate them. MMT is just saying you consolidate one more administrative agency and a set of government corporations that are part of that relationship, and talking about the accounting, how the accounting looks like. So it's not an argument that relies on a direct overdraft between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. It has never relied on that argument. It hasn't relied on that argument when Kelton's foundational article on this from like 98, 99. It's never relied on this. This has always been an invented straw man from critics who seem to struggle with reading comprehension. And MMT could be wrong about this point. It could be, this analytical argument could be irrelevant, but whether or not that's true, that is what MMT is argument. It's not arguing that there's some direct overdraft between the Fed and the Treasury. Further, when you look at things from this point of view, and you think, well, aren't Treasury securities really, a monetary policy tool serving a certain role, as MMT has always argued, about draining settlement balances, draining money, draining what are generally called central bank reserves, that shouldn't the Fed have the responsibility to issue those securities and treasure and spending, quote unquote, out of the Treasury come out of a different pocket? And one of the interesting things when you run through the accounting is if you just had the Treasury, quote unquote, money finance itself directly, and you had the Federal Reserve issue securities after the fact, the consolidated accounting looks identical than under our current arrangement where the Treasury issues securities and the Federal Reserve doesn't issue securities. It buys and sells the securities that the Treasury issues. So that's the kind of the core brass tacks of that kind of argument from the MMT point of view. And I should say that, I've been started a monetary policy 201 series where I'm going to be running through long set of conversations about, these ideas and debates about money financing and, doing that by talking about a bunch of government memos that I got from the National Archives, which haven't been previously in the public record, to kind of break down and really, get to the meat of these ideas of these sort of debates.
Hey, Jack, can I just respond real quickly?
Of course.
Okay, so again, just on this narrow point of, I wasn't saying the MMTers, if they want to do this consolidated accounting, that's wrong or they can't do that. Here is the direct quote from page 29 of Kelton's book. She says, to provision itself with F-35 fighters, the U.S. Treasury instructed its bank, the Federal Reserve, to carry out the payment on its behalf. The Fed does this by marking up the numbers in Lockheed's bank account. Congress doesn't need to, quote, find the money to spend it. It needs to find the votes. Once it has the votes, it can authorize the spending. The rest is just accounting. As the checks go out, the Federal Reserve clears the payments by crediting the seller's account with the appropriate number of digital dollars known as bank reserves. That's why MMT sometimes describes the Fed as the scorekeeper for the dollar. The scorekeeper can't run out of points. All right, and I'm saying that is just not correct. No, if the Treasury instructs its bank,
every statement there is correct. You are just annoyed that she doesn't also insert there, and the Treasury's general account is debited.
And if they instructed the Fed to spend, look, I can tell my Bank of America to credit my local grocery store a certain amount, and that I can't run out of points, right? And then you say, oh, well, all you left out, Bob, was that if you tell them to spend more than is in your balance, they will say no. And that's exactly what happens if the Treasury tells the Fed, pay Lockheed Martin more than's in our balance, that the Fed will say, we're not legally allowed to do that. So if you want to say that's just
first of all, there's no, I mean, just
that's the whole thing under dispute. That's the whole issue that we're arguing about.
No, I mean, no, it isn't the whole issue that under dispute. I mean, first of all, just as a point of fact, there hasn't actually been any documented examples where the Fed tells the Treasury, no, you don't have money in your account. We're not gonna, clear this payment. In fact, if you read the memos that I've gotten through, FOIA about what the Fed would do in case of Treasury defaults, a lot of what those memos discussion, of course, there's other documents to discuss it too, but I'm focusing on what I've got through Roya, is that precisely because the payment system operates just on the premise of clearing treasury payments and just, taking on presumption that, the treasury is managing a certain thing, that they need to operationally change. They would need to operationally change the system in order to deal with the treasury literally not having the legal authority to fill its account in the specific way of issuing treasury securities. So operationally, literally in the system, that's not how it works. And under our current arrangements, and in practice, let's say the Treasury gets a daylight overdraft like it did in the 1920s, and credited that account. Who's going to go after the Treasury, and the Fed lawyers gonna start a lawsuit with the Treasury. In practice, yes. So, which isn't to say, yes, under our current arrangements, the Treasury generally aims for, used to be $5 billion in Treasury General account. It's now gotten more volatile and higher. But this idea, the idea that first of all, that factual claim that the Fed will just not clear a payment is not true under our current arrangements. And second, the MMT's argument is not saying that the Treasury is not going to aim or regularly pursue having a positive balance in the Treasury General account. As Jack was saying, this is a framing for an audience, and it's a framing you don't like, but there's because it is de-emphasizing what you want to emphasize. But every single statement that she said in that quote is correct. It's just de-emphasizing a thing that you think should be the central part of the conversation, and obviously she does not.
Okay, and everything that was said there could also truthfully be said about me telling my Bank of America to do it. The only thing we admitted is that if you instruct them to spend more than's in the account, they might say no. And I think you said, if we go back to 1920s, there was a time when it didn't happen. So you're agreeing in practice this is not how it happens, and we're just quibbling about in a counterfactual where they did.
Well, no,
we're not sure. You're saying I've got memos saying if this never happened, that's how they would do it. But Kelton's making it sound like this is how it happened. Every Tuesday, this is what happens.
I mean,
that's not what happened.
I think in practice, daylight overdrafts have regularly happened in this system.
I've overdrafted too.
Legal authority expired.
Small amounts.
And
Bank of America covers my overdrafts too.
But
I'm a monetary sovereign.
But then it's stab, not tabs. Again, the MMT argument has not been that the Treasury isn't issuing Treasury securities, that the Treasury isn't getting a positive balance in its TGA. What it is saying is that that the spending comes first, and then the taxing and quote unquote borrowing comes later. The acronym, she has two acronyms, TABS and STAB. Mm-hmm. It's not tab and then ST. It's STAB, and that B is the quote unquote borrowing. So there's still, in her narrative, still bond issuance. What she is saying is talking about money finance, that when they spend, it's crediting bank accounts. When they're taxing, it's debiting bank accounts and debiting, reserve accounts. That is what she's talking about. It's, there's money emission, and then there is something after the fact that comes in terms of bond issuance. When you consolidate the system, that's how it appears. So the bond issuance is part of her narrative. It's just she is changing the framing of how it looks. And of course, those kind of internal accounting arrangements and complexities between the Treasury and the Fed that we can talk about all day, regardless of the exact details of them, they clearly set up a very different system than you being like, oh, I can direct my local bank to go send a payment. Yes, if you personally, going to overdraft your account, have a whole bunch of fees, whatever, but clearly that the arrangements between the Fed and the Treasury are quite different, and you don't have in a monetary instrument, a focus of monetary policy instrument like the Treasury security. Another way of looking at that this is just about internal accounting arrangements is, how operationally the system wouldn't look that different if it was central bank securities and then direct Treasury money finance rather than indirect federal government as a whole money finance. Or as Kelton's favorite phrase, covert money finance. So you might not like that framing, but there is a point to the framing that she's making, and it's not a point that sidesteps that government securities are issued.
Okay, so there's STAB, where that's a theory that the Federal Reserve, the Treasury spends money and then it taxes and borrows to replace the money, and versus TAB.
The federal government as a whole. That's the point.
Yes. So the government doesn't need to tax and borrow to get the money, put it all in a bunch, and then spend it. They can spend the money first. Nathan, okay, so on the point of overdrafts, I actually recently learned from Daryl Duffy of Stanford that prior to the Great Financial Crisis, a lot of commercial banks actually regularly did run overdrafts at the Federal Reserve because there wasn't a penalty. So I don't know about the Treasury, but I mean, if JP Morgan's doing it, like theoretically, probably the Treasury could do it too. But Nathan, you yourself said that your whole point of MMT, it doesn't rely on this overdraft. Okay, and Nathan, I don't have a problem with consolidating the Treasury and the Fed. But if you do that, that fighter jet is still being financed by Treasury issuance that's not coming from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is not buying the Treasury and monetizing the debt. It's still coming from the private sector. The private sector is still financing, right?
I mean, you can describe that way. You can say that you're financing the federal government right now if you have some physical cash in your pocket. And MMT's argument is that these sets of instruments are a very, very different sort of animal. They're a very different sort of beast than the sort of, under our modern monetary arrangements. They're a very different beast than, what people are traditionally thinking about when they're thinking about financing. If you want to say that, like, yes, there's literally some private sector entities are holding them. You can also, but that is a different thing than, say, my credit card debt, to say Chase. It's a different type of thing, and the point in MMT's emphasized, but it was also something that you can get from, say, Zoltan Pozar or all sorts of different scholars in this area, is that Treasury securities themselves, especially Treasury bills, have a moneyness to them, and that there is this payment system which includes Federal Reserve monetary policy that that backstops and transforms these instruments into something that's very different. And yes, the central bank is an instrument, is part of this wider federal government setup. The unique thing that MMT is pointing to is not that there's money printing, but that monetary policy is the determiner of interest rates. And yes, it is the determiner of interest rates across the Treasury's yield curve. And that since this is a policy, that these interest rates are a policy choice, that makes them a very, very different creature than how this is sort of traditionally thought of, or private sector debts. Obviously, there's more to say, but
yeah. Bob?
Yeah. So just big picture here, and I actually wasn't going to bring this stuff up. It was just, Jack, you pointed to my review and asked me to comment on that. So my modest point there, I don't need to get hung up and die on this hill, because they could just change the rules tomorrow and say, yes, now the Fed is obligated to cover the Treasury's overspending if they have an overdraft on their account. They could do that. Nothing would stop them legally. It's not like the laws of physics would prevent them from doing it. So I don't want to put a bunch of weight on that. My point is merely, a lot of the MMT people say, like, hey, we're just describing how the world works. I'm sorry you guys don't like, math. And I'm saying, if you read Kelton's book and she's explaining what happens when the government buys fighter jets, I'm saying, if you didn't already independently know how it works, you would walk away thinking it was different from what it is. And that's my point. And then again, but if they can do that, fine. And yes, I agree that I can't there's not some entity that's going to print money and cover my overdrafts. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing in general that people can't counterfeit, because what would happen if they could is a bunch of people would be buying stuff and not producing, and that would just push up prices. It doesn't make us all wealthier if we could all print money. And that doesn't change just because we give politicians the printing press. No, actually, it's the same thing. It's just limited to a select group of people. So again, it's this idea that we can bolster balance sheets and maybe there's inflation, but that's exactly what I'm saying. You can make everyone's balance sheet great by giving them either treasury securities or outright cash, which are liabilities of the Federal Reserve. And that makes everyone's assets go up, but that makes prices go up too. And so you're not making everybody richer collectively by just creating money.
Bob, Nathan earlier referenced that basically treasury bills are very similar to money. You disagree with that. Tell us why you don't think treasury debt is money. And then also, if I can just play, somewhat of a semantic game with you, but you said giving politicians the printing press. As we know, the way that the government, quote unquote, prints money is by issuing treasury bills. So aren't they printing money? It's treasury bills. So aren't treasury bills money?
Well, no, there I was consolidating. I was saying the Federal Reserve, right? Okay. So I will. So let me extend an olive branch. And guys like Brad DeLong were writing this in the early days of QE, and I know, Nathan, you were saying this earlier tonight. So I understand the point that, hey, in the grand scheme of things, like QE, quantitative easing, what the heck is that supposed to do? Because it's just taking government debt and swapping it for cash, which is another form of a government debt, and especially when interest rates are already close to zero, or at least on government debt are close to zero. The difference between a T-bill that's yielding 0.1% and reserve balances with the Fed is that's pretty, there's not much of a difference there. And so swapping one for the other with these massive QE programs in the grand scheme, what is that really doing? So I understand that. And, and I'm not conceding anything there. I wasn't in favor of QE. I didn't think QE was going to do anything, was going to be good. So I'm not, losing anything by admitting that. But my point, I think what you're referring to, Jack, is there is a difference between actual money and T-bills. For example, if I go to the grocery store, I can buy things either with $100 bills, or if I have IOUs from commercial banks, that most merchants take those at par with cash. If I try to buy my groceries with a T-bill, they're not going to accept it. So yes, it's very liquid, but it's not literally the same thing as money. So that's my modest point. There's nothing earth-shattering there, but I'm, again, with a lot of these claims that I'm just saying, for all of the talk about how MMT is accurately describing things, I'm going to say, well, no, actually, I'm not saying Nathan in particular, but a lot of MMT people, when they're telling the public how the monetary and banking system works, they say things that are not correct. And so, I occasionally say, wait a minute, that's not right.
I think to close out this debate, I'd love if, we could exchange a few questions between our debaters. Who wants to go first and having a question for the other one?
I'll ask a question. Yeah. So Nathan, I think a lot of this comes down to, the differences in terms of what's the scope here. Do you think right now, for example, if the political class and the public in terms of their support for it, if they just understood, hey, let's stop fretting about where we're going to find the money and just realize ultimately the problem is real resource constraints, not nominal debt obligations from the federal government. Are you saying there would be all of these programs that could be financed and it would work? right now, like we could have, universal health care and a Green New Deal and all these sorts of things right now? Or is it just the next time there's a big recession?
Good question. I think if people are truly convinced, if it's not just like, a little fad, 2 weeks, someone does a kind of Nixon-esque, like we're all MMTers now, and then it fades. No, but if it's actually convinced, because being convinced would mean immediately a significant amount of structural changes to how we do the budgetary process. It would mean a whole bunch of changes to how the CBO operates and how the CBO assesses things. And I think in that process of high level, you have, dozens of economists, you have a, different modus operandi of like focusing on different things, a different sort of scope of analysis, then all sorts of opportunities would pop up in assessing that. One of those opportunities would be, okay, what kind of, if budgeting is about, and pay-fors are not about revenue, but they're about demand offsets or, capacity constraints and so on, what kind of opportunities are there for pay-fors that we would like, that non-fiscal pay-fors that we would like, maybe if we want to avoid raising taxes, and pursuing those things to reallocate resources and make room for sets of spending programs. I think that a lot of opportunities would emerge from that process, but it's not like, the opportunity is doing, say, the American Rescue Plan again, and just doing that over and over and over again. So it would be a larger process, and you can look at my monetary policy report for some of my preliminary thinking on that. But yeah, that's kind of how I would go about it. And it's also one of the constraints being quote unquote time, that there are all sorts of constraints of things that we would want to loosen. That would come out of that in terms of programs that would be developing new resources, solving key bottlenecks over time. On universal healthcare, I would say universal healthcare absolutely is something that, do it right now. That would be something that could be easily on the table. You would again have to do analysis, but universal healthcare, single payer, Medicare for all is a program that involves a lot of, rationalizing our spending on healthcare. We spend 17% of GDP on healthcare, built into what Medicare transition to a Medicare for all type system would be reducing a lot of the spending that the quote unquote private sector does on healthcare. And maybe it would involve some new taxes, but, if you approach the health insurance that, is, for individuals, they kind of have to, if they work at an employer that has health insurance, more likely than not is essentially mandatory from their point of view, it's not going to look that different, and it's going to regularize that process. So you might say, it includes quote unquote raising taxes, but health insurance in a certain sense is a kind of private sector tax. And so I think universal health
just to clarify on that, and Jack, this is just one quick follow-up, Jack.
Of course.
So just on that though, so I understand what you're saying, but to me that just sounds like, you even said that there's 17% spending on it. So it sounds like you're saying that spending could be more rationally directed, and maybe there's taxes. So couldn't a non-MMT or who's just, a government intervention supporter in terms of single payer say the same thing? Like, in other words, I don't see why the insight that, hey, the government, there's no spending because we can find the money. I don't see how that's the solving it if you're kind of just admitting, we're just kind of rearranging the use of the resources. There's not all this excess capacity that we're mobilizing by the insight of, hey, we're not constrained by a budget. So I'm saying MMT adding something to that just a regular, Keynesian who's in favor of single payer wouldn't already know?
I think the difference is the assessment, because it's not going to be about revenue and collecting the revenue. It's going to be about demand offsets. That tax program is going to look very different. I mean, in a certain sense, part of this is also that MMT has a negative answer to a lot of, say, traditional progressive approaches, because MMT is probably going to say, look at the answer of, let's just tax the rich and do the program that we want to do. That probably is not going to go particularly well. So in a certain sense, MMT has like a more pessimistic answer than certain types of progressives. But I also think if you do the full analysis, a lot of opportunities in that process would emerge. And the amount, what the we need a tax for revenue answer will get you, I think would get you a, much less attractive program than, a demand, we need a tax for demand offset answer.
Thank you. Nathan, do you have any questions for Bob?
Do you have any questions for Bob? I think a lot of my questions were answered or just intrigued or piqued by his commentary on the 20s and 30s.
You want to know who my barber is?
I'll ask this because I guess I don't really have any idea. In terms of an issue like climate change and a issue of fitting your larger philosophy of just if the government gets out of the way, the private sector will figure out on its own. How does something like climate change fit into that general worldview? Is it just say carbon tax or cap and trade and let's do it, or what is your vision as an Austrian economist approach to climate change?
Okay, sure. So I'll try to keep this brief, Jack. So a couple things in terms of just the actual real world situation as I understand it. And I've written a lot of stuff on this over the years. For example, William Nordhaus's Nobel Prize winning or Nobel Memorial Prize winning work on the economics of climate change, for example, says that if the governments of the world limited global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that would be worse for humanity than doing nothing, right? And so I'm just showing in terms of some of the economic modeling on this topic, and I know the progressive activists think that Nordhaus's model is crazy. I get that, but my point is, in terms of people saying, "Hey, look at the
climate scientists think his model's crazy."
Okay, but I'm saying that this is not nut jobs at the Heritage Foundation versus the respectable mainstream. I'm saying that it was actually the same weekend, just to show the contrast. The same weekend that Nordhaus wins the Nobel Memorial Prize for his work on that was when the UN released the booklet on the IPCC's report on limiting warming to 1.5 C. So I'm just saying the contrast between these things, whereas that's all reported in the New York Times, is the same thing. So there's that. Having said all that, also in terms of the logistics, I don't just think it's practical that you can have these global trees and I don't think, for example, no matter what the US or Europe does, I think China and India are going to do their thing. All right. So that's my view in terms of that. Having said that, and I'm not as worried, I don't think it is an existential threat posed to humanity. I think looking at standard models by the year 2100, even if they don't do anything, it will be that, humanity, instead of being this many times richer on average, will be somewhat less richer on average, compared to today. So I think it's that type of analysis. Having said all that, though, I have written stuff more theoretical saying, what if, not putting all my chips on empirically, I don't think it's as bad as Nathan Tankus or Steve Keen say it is. Because, what if it really were? And I do think that, yes, in a free market, you could have property rights issues where that could be assigned. Just, in general, for example, last thing I'll say on that, it's not that someone like a Murray Rothbard, who's a giant in the Austrian school in libertarianism, he wasn't in favor of corporations being able to dump chemicals into the river because then they can make more TVs and that makes GDP go up. No, his complaint was it was actually government intervention that threw out a lot of the common law ability of, households to have injunctions against violations of property rights in the name of fostering economic growth, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the libertarian view is a respect for property rights. And so, yes, if it could be demonstrated that, the cows farting is going to cause damage to someone across the ocean, I think in a private system, you could come up with ways, to legally stop that. But my real world right now, I think government action to limit that is just giving them cover to intervene in the electricity and transportation sector.
So Bob, let's say hypothetically, you actually agreed that climate change was an existential threat. We needed to get to zero net carbon emissions by 2050 or even 2040. Would you grant that the private sector, like investing in green energy, green bonds in Europe, BlackRock doing that, would be woefully insufficient to get there, and that there would have to be grand government action, or on a massive scale? In the same way, in World War II, you can't rely on the private sector, for America to invade Europe and free the world, right? You do have to have concentrated actions. Would you grant that, or no?
Okay, so again, no, I wouldn't grant that. Even if there is a problem, in general, I think having governments of the world solve it is a very bad idea. And so, I'll bite the bullet and just say this, and I know I'm going to alienate some people who may have been with me up till now. I don't think U.S. entry into World War II was a good thing on net. Okay, so, I'm just saying a lot of these examples, people point, oh, well, clearly the government had to do it. No, I mean, among other things, it gave half of Europe to Stalin and, had the Cold War and all the deaths in Korea and Vietnam and so on. So it's not obvious that all these things are great. But in general, if it really were a problem, I mean, there are things people are working on in terms of emergency stopgap measures to buy us time. That, things like, Freeman Dyson came up with ideas about genetically engineering trees to absorb more carbon, stuff like that. So I don't think that stuff would be necessary, but I'm saying even if there is a problem, to say, oh, I know, who's going to solve this is all the governments of the world, because they're so noble and good at getting things done. And I don't understand why that's the go-to default position that I think theory and practice show governments do not solve problems. They say they are, and then they do all sorts of horrible things under the guise of solving this problem.
Thank you, Bob. Nathan, I'll give you the final word. What do you think is one thing that not Austrians, not neoclassical economists, but actual Keynesians and more mainstream economists, what do you think is the one thing that they get wrong about MMT?
I mean, I think a lot of the same things that they get wrong have popped up in this conversation. Some of, we've obviously talked about some different things. I will say I'm glad I thought to ask the climate change question. I think that did a lot of my work for me. And I would say that I think the thing that people miss the most is MMT isn't just going, hey, and from specifically mainstream economists who struggle with this, isn't going, hey, there isn't money printing in your models. And they look at, the model, well, look, I had money printing right there. So MMT is wrong, but disappears the role of monetary policy with quote unquote government securities, and that price setting role rather than quantity role of, oh, well, we need to have more of the money supply in there and less of and more of the reserves in there and less of the government securities. But that what the Federal Reserve does is set interest rates, and not just at the short end, but over the yield curve. And it's that setting of interest rates that, say, keeps even keel with GDP growth, is the thing that, it is a monetary policy question at essence, whether government debt is gonna, or government debt is gonna go to, say, 10,000% of GDP or whatever, rather than just sort of strictly a question of, oh, we need to get in there and do quote unquote money printing. And that it's an answer to what a lot of these traditional models, what Oliver Blanchard's models on the intertemporal government constraint, and that there's actually a technical response to what a lot of these models are arguing, rather than just sort of, reasserting that money creation happens or exists or is possible. And the work of the economist Scott Fulwiler, currently at University of Missouri Kansas City, is kind of foundational to kind of putting forward that sort of technical answer to what mainstream quote unquote Keynesians talk about or argue against MMT.
Well, this has been a really interesting discussion. Nathan, I don't think you've convinced Bob. Bob, I don't think you convinced Nathan. We all knew that was going to happen, but I think we, for the audience, have made clear a lot of the disagreements, and hopefully they can, look up more and continue to learn more about this. Nathan and Bob, I'd like to thank you for being part of this debate. I'd like to thank ZeroHedge for hosting it, JM Bullion for sponsoring it, and Liam Cosgrove for organizing it. I will say, Bob, I agree with something you said in the beginning, that actually, as much as modern monetary theory and Austrian economics disagree on so many things, one thing they actually have in common, apart from a lot of mainstream economics, is that they really do like to focus on money, the monetary system, banking, the plumbing of the financial sector. And I will say that is something that I really focus on my podcast, Monetary Matters. So if people are listening to this on ZeroHedge, they check out my show, Monetary Matters, which is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and on YouTube. Just a few guests who I'll be interviewing over the next month. Someone who used to write the Global Financial Stability Report for the IMF. I'll be speaking with the former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. I'll be speaking with the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, as well as the former governor of the Central Bank of Ireland. Come right over. The water is warm. Nathan's work can be found at crisisnotes.com/ZeroHedge. And Bob, tell the good people at home where they can find you and your work.
Sure. So go to Infinio.ai to see what we do over at Infinio, putting financial assets on the blockchain. And if you go to Mises.org, you can see the Human Action podcast that I host there.
Nice. And Nathan is at Nathan Tankus on Twitter. Bob is at Bob Murphy Econ. Thank you again, everyone. Until next time.